so I saw many similarities between how Bitcoin's consensus algorithm works and how our voting system works. And I felt that it was a unique opportunity to reach a completely different type of population with a message around truth. And specifically, how do we arrive at truth, which is effectively what Bitcoin does.
Welcome to this bonus episode of the Adopting Bitcoin series, with an extended version of the interview that I did with Carlos Toriello. And before the episode, here is a quick shout out to our sponsor, Bare Bitcoin. Unfortunately, they will only work for the Norwegian context. But if you are in Norway, check out their app. It's honestly the best place to buy Bitcoin that I have ever tried. And use the QR on the screen for a special bonus.
Cheers.
Cheers, Nikolai.
Welcome
to Guatemala.
Thank you so much. What a welcoming. So why don't you start just by telling me a little bit about yourself? Like how did you get where you are today?
Sure, tried to do the brief version. Born and raised in Guatemala City. Had the opportunity to study in the US. Came back to Central America, worked in the region. And then finally, my father was starting a new business. And so I came back from, was living in Costa Rica, working there. And so I came back to help him with a new business. And so we were trying to get that off the ground. And my dad's been an entrepreneur all his life. So I figured I would have the opportunity to learn directly from a mentor. We were doing that. And then one day, some of the companies in our business group were added to the United States Treasury Office of Foreign Asset Control specially designated narcotics kingpin and terrorist watch list, which is called the opaque list. It's basically the kiss of death in the financial system. We found out overnight reading the newspaper, and that made it very clear to me the value and the importance of censorship-resistant money. When a bureaucrat in another country can just press a button and erase your ability to use your own money without any opportunity to defend yourself, without any warning. People assumed if we were added to the list, it must have been because we were doing something. Didn't matter that we had 35 years of business experience. It took us 2 years to get off of the list and finally receive a letter saying, you're not on the list. There was no sorry, no nothing. And eventually the businesses went bankrupt. And so effectively 35 years of my father's work and legacy was destroyed. I was exposed to the ideas of Bitcoin. First, I fell down it's blockchain, not Bitcoin propaganda, which still to this day has created a lot of damage in Guatemala. There are many people in Guatemala that believe blockchain, not Bitcoin. And so it's a matter of reassessing that. I wasted many hours and energy and time and friends and anyway, in exploring that. And it wasn't until COVID that I really went back into the Bitcoin rabbit hole and realized that Bitcoin is really the only thing that matters. Yes, it's blockchain, but the only blockchain that matters, because it's the only one that no one controls, is Bitcoin. And then throughout this time, I was also a volunteer in the election system. In Guatemala, we have a voting system that is kind of like a civilian army. It gets essentially kind of conscription every 4 years. We mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. It's like a voluntary service. And so if you're concerned about the legitimacy of the election, the easiest thing for you to do is to participate in the election so that you protect it, right?
Okay.
And so I did that in 2011 and 2015, and I fell in love with the process. And I realized that elections, or more specifically voting systems, are effectively consensus algorithms.
Okay.
And so specifically how our system works, it is a proof of work consensus algorithm where the civilian army act kind of like coin join coordinators or miners, and then the political parties are the validating nodes. And so I saw many similarities between how Bitcoin consensus algorithm works and how our voting system works. And I felt that it was a unique opportunity to reach a completely different type of population with a message around truth. And specifically, how do we arrive at truth, which is effectively what Bitcoin does. And so in 2019, my father ran for Congress, and he asked me to help. And I said, what I can do is I can audit the system because I know how it works. And so let me check the system. And so in 2019, I was plugged into the system when the system collapsed.
The system collapsed during the elections. That's pretty severe.
So for the first time in over 30 years, since our democracy got rebooted in 1985, we had people from all sides of the democratic spectrum accusing the system of fraud. There's effectively a website where the results are published. That website collapsed on election night. So since I can remember when I was born, the media reports the news based on this official source that comes from the election authorities. And basically on election night in 2019, the media was, telling the story, oh, yellow party is winning, purple party, and then, oh, the feed is gone. Like, we don't know what happened. Check back tomorrow. And then you check back tomorrow and, oh, now it's red party. And then, oh, the feed is gone again. And then it's back on, and then it's off, on, off, on, off, on. The worst possible scenario you can imagine. Our system is paper-based, but we publish the results through an internet digital system. And so what collapsed was the internet digital system. You still had the paper, but people didn't have the patience to do a full thing. And so I realized our system effectively didn't work anymore because people weren't willing to do the work. You had politicians that didn't care about the reality of the consensus. Rather, they were negotiating the outcome. And so I tried to fix it in 2019, but I failed miserably. And so then in 2023, I came back. The effort is now known as digitalwitness.io. So that's the website, digitalwitness.io. In Spanish, it's fiscaldigital.net. And basically what we propose is a real-time election audit of the entire voting system using Bitcoin. In order to do so, we needed to use Bitcoin on two fronts. I describe it as kind of the base layer and then the second layer. On the base layer, it's the documents that are published to the internet have to be timestamped to Bitcoin so that they cannot be altered without leaving a trace. We do that through the Open Timestamps protocol, and the company emerged called Simple Proof, where I now work. And they were contracted by the election authorities to timestamp, using the Open Timestamp protocol, all the hundreds of thousands of documents. This meant that if what happened in 2019 happened again, where the system collapsed, when they rebooted, they could reboot, but prove using cryptography, mathematics, and Bitcoin that the reboot is exactly the same state as before. And so basically you use Bitcoin as a type of clock. So any digital system, you can use the protocol to establish what the state of the system is in a certain point in time. So on elections, it's on election night, this is what the state of the system is. And so if anyone tries to rewrite history, it becomes obvious.
And it's stored in the blockchain forever.
So it's through the up return function, and it's not, it's through a series of Merkle trees. So it's very, very data efficient. The important thing to understand is this is not like ordinals. This is not like inscriptions. This is the Open Timestamps protocol, where all we need is one transaction per block. And in that one transaction, you can timestamp through Merkle trees and practically or almost infinite amount of data and prove that something existed at a specific moment in time. In the case of elections, this is incredibly valuable because it means that the only moment when data can be produced is election night. If anyone tries to change the data after election night, it becomes provable. And so instead of having these arguments of what you think versus I think, it's purely what happened. So essentially it's the election authority on election night publishes information to the internet, but as it's publishing, it's timestamping everything to Bitcoin so that even if they're attacked by anyone, they can always say, this is our information from election night. And then separately, as an election auditor, what I did was I download all of that data, and I collaborated with a company called Stackwork that uses the Lightning Network to allow people to do a lot of work on their phone in exchange for sats. And so we created a tool by which anyone could get online and use their phones to earn sats in exchange for auditing the election in real time. And so within 48 hours, we had checked and verified the presidential results to see whether or not the official result matched what exactly was published via Bitcoin, and thereby determined that there was, in our opinion, a 0.001% chance that election fraud could have occurred, despite there being serious accusations of election fraud by the establishment and the losing government. The government from 2019, I believe, was a product of election fraud. In 2023, they lose, and immediately they accuse the winners of election fraud. So, in my opinion, they got there for election fraud, and so they're accusing everyone else of doing that. But really, we checked everything. And so actually what Bitcoin allows us to do is prove that the accusations by the justice system that are literally in court right now, and there are people in jail right now because of this, are being accused of election fraud. You can prove that those accusations are baseless using Bitcoin. However, the court system here, it's not exactly a functioning justice system, but I hope that eventually the case will be made at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court will have to use Bitcoin to determine whether or not election fraud actually took place. And that would be, I think, the first time in the world where an election result, especially a judicial case of a national magnitude, would be determined thanks to Bitcoin. Now I work with Simple Proof, and we are offering these services to anyone in the world, and hope to build a world where no one can rewrite history. And I want to live in a world where all governments produce public records, but they cannot go back and change history. And we can use Bitcoin to do that. I think it's important for us to live in a world like that because, first of all, no one can change history. No one should have that kind of power. But in addition, as artificial intelligence starts to become more and more common, it might not be that human beings are changing history. It might be that the machines are starting to write our history for us. I have young children. How do I know when they are reading a book that the book that they're reading is actually produced by a human being instead of some machine that is pretending to be a human being? Right. So I firmly believe that if we don't use Bitcoin to anchor human existence, our reality will effectively unravel, and we will become victims of our own, injustice. We have to make sure that our history is grounded on reality, and that nothing can change that reality without it being obvious. If we don't do that, I think you can go back to when the printing press was invented by Gutenberg. You had the need, for example, to establish what is the Bible. It became very easy for anyone to just produce Nikolai's book of the Bible, right? And so unless you had an effort to say, this is the Bible, right? And famously what happened was the King James Bible. That is effectively the analogy that I see, but for everything. Not just the Bible, but literally the entirety of human existence. If we don't all come together and agree, we're going to use Bitcoin as our single source of truth in terms of what happened in the past, we risk very, very powerful machines coming out in the future that may not even respond to a human being, but some kind of warped logic. And if humanity doesn't know what its own history is, then the machines definitely won't know what to do. And so I fear it's a cycle that can feed on itself, where basically the entirety of human existence just unravels because we don't have something sound. And it's funny because people talk of sound money, and Bitcoin is the soundest money. And so it's the same argument for money, and money is just the most important ledger. And so what I'm thinking, my position is, we have to use Bitcoin for basically all of our ledgers, because otherwise, how do you know that you can trust the information? And you can't.
If you take me back to the 2023 elections, is it an ongoing?
The crisis is still ongoing. There is a judicial case against many people. One of them has been sent to jail. The authorities are trying to defend themselves against the justice system, but it's kind of stupid and ridiculous, because what they are fundamentally arguing is that the current president, who effectively rules Guatemala
Uh-huh.
is
And one
illegitimate.
Uh-huh.
And so the
The
justice,
one who won, or
the one,
Yeah,
that is in power right now,
Gotcha.
his own justice department,
Hmm.
the prosecutor, is arguing that he is illegitimate. So Guatemala has a constitutional crisis right now, where you have the justice system trying to destroy the executive branch and, by definition, the legislative branch. I hope will be resolved somewhat soon, but to be honest, it's ridiculous that the president has allowed it to get to this point. His first matter of business needed to be, the people have spoken, this is it. But the fact that this crisis continues puts Guatemala in a situation where it's very hard to do anything, because no one knows if he's going to be in power tomorrow or if he maybe will be thrown in jail, accused of stealing the election. It could happen. I don't think it's going to happen, but it could. And so it's important, certainty, just like in Bitcoin, that's what we want. The reason we love Bitcoin is every time the block reaches, 6 blocks, that transaction is absolutely permanent, right? And so certainty is incredibly valuable. Right now, we don't have that. However, that's, it's more or less how Guatemala is all the time. But regardless, there is a lot of hope in Guatemala because we finally changed. We have a very different government. The way I summarize it is Guatemala has, over the past 80 years, had essentially the same status quo, the same establishment. They just changed the management. So it's the same owners, the same philosophy, the same ideology, but just different management. They changed the clown that they put in front, right? This is the first time in about 80 years where this manager reports to a separate group of owners. And so it's forcing change. So for example, there's a group right now that is also making the case that Guatemala should evaluate a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And they're making the case to the Central Bank of Guatemala. It's not very optimistic, but at the very least, there is a group of us that is doing everything we can. Before Donald Trump and the United States acquires a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the United States and changes the game completely, at the very least, Guatemala should try to follow El Salvador's lead and have Bitcoin on our balance sheet as a hedge against the United States doing this and leaving us behind, right? We have to at least try to beat the United States to the strategic Bitcoin reserve. The president has the opportunity to do so. Guatemala has reserves. We could acquire around $2 billion worth of Bitcoin without it changing anything. And Guatemala could still have 3 times as much Bitcoin as El Salvador has and maintain the delicate balance of power that Central America has had over the previous 500 years. Now, if the president doesn't, get his act together, and if the banking authorities don't adopt the Bitcoin strategic reserve, then I am convinced that the balance of power that has existed in Guatemala, in Central America, for 500 years will be completely transformed. And more likely, El Salvador will now go on to be the leader of the region. For 500 years, Guatemala has been the leader of the region. In order for us to maintain that leadership, we must not allow this opportunity to escape us. Otherwise, we will now start to follow El Salvador. Which, personally, as a Guatemalan, if my leaders don't see where the puck is going, I'm more than happy to work with my Salvadoran friends to help bring a new peaceful time in our history. But I would like for my country to not miss this opportunity.
We touched upon the US with the strategic reserve, and also earlier with the blacklist that your father's company
briefly was a part of, yes.
Yeah. What is it like to be sort of one of the neighbors of the US?
For me, I believe that it is very clear that Guatemala is effectively a slave exporting colony of the United States. Over 30% of our economy is remittances that are being sent down to the country by our own citizens working in the United States, chasing the American dream. So we have been incapable of producing opportunities for our people to stay here and create a prosperous life for themselves. And so they go to the United States as second, third class citizens, cleaning toilets or whatever, and sending money down to their family. That is basically what we are. We export cheap labor to the United States. Anything that happens to the United States is felt much more severely here. The saying says, when the United States sneezes, Latin America catches a cold. And Central America is blown away. So, we are a vassal state. We are at the whims of whatever happens in Washington and New York. But that does mean that we have more versatility, right? We could, we're smaller, we are fast, we can move faster. When big, huge changes are happening worldwide, like for example, Bitcoin becoming the important strategic reserve for all nations, Guatemala could very quickly just make this decision in the next 30 days and still take advantage of the repricing of the entire world in Bitcoin. So I'm hopeful, but I mean, it's tricky, right? I am more optimistic now that I have been in the past for Guatemala because I do think there is the potential for an American Renaissance based on basically the ideals of the American Revolution led by Bitcoin. Hopefully, the people that are in power now in the United States are able to create this new era and avoid the mistakes of the past, primarily endless war and death, nuclear exchange, and World War III. That's I would really, really like for that to not happen. And I believe Bitcoin is the best that we have in terms of our shot, at least as common people. I consider myself just a pleb. What can I do in this giant sea where everything is changing? Well, I can at least do my best to get more Guatemalans and more Central Americans to understand Bitcoin and adopt Bitcoin faster than everywhere else in the world. Because if Central America adopts Bitcoin before the rest of the world, it is a kind of tide that lifts all boats, right? It's just in my opinion, the smartest, fastest way to actually change people's lives for the better.
What would you say is the current state of Bitcoin adoption in Guatemala? I mean, we've talked about the use of Bitcoin, the blockchain, I guess, in the elections, and then I visited Lago Bitcoin, where around 8% of the vendors accept Bitcoin.
We are very, very early. That being said, I'm sure that we are more farther along than other places, simply because El Salvador is right next door. Bukele is everyone's hero. If Bukele were allowed to run for presidency, and legally nothing is stopping him, the Constitution of Central America allows for Bukele to run for president in Guatemala,
Guatemala as
and Honduras, potentially even Nicaragua and Costa Rica, but I would assume he would only consider running for Honduras and Guatemala. He would win. He would have won last year here, but he chose to remain in El Salvador. And so the fact that he is now talking about Bitcoin again forces a lot of people to think about it, right? However, there's so much noise that is very easy for people to get lost in the noise. And especially, I think, poverty is a kind of boot on your neck, right? When you don't have enough to eat tomorrow, you don't have time to do anything, particularly understand how monetary systems work, etc., right? But I do think that particularly Guatemala has a very unique circumstance in being what I would say is the fastest bottom-up adopter in the Bitcoin race, right? You could argue that the United States is going to win, but after the United States, I would say Guatemala has a lot of characteristics that might lead for many people to adopt Bitcoin quickly. Like I said, we depend on remittances, so
Yeah,
everyone has someone that sends them money,
yeah.
and so
Not having to pay Western Union fees and
Bitcoin,
getting the money instantly.
Bitcoin as a transnational instant settlement network is a very easy sell. But there are companies here, for example, Osmo is very well known and is doing making a lot of progress. It's a Guatemalan strike kind of equivalent. And so anyone that wants to send remittances from the United States to Guatemala can just download Osmo and start doing it like very easily, paying very affordable fees and also 24/7 service, right? So anyway, there's a lot of tools that will increasingly become more aware. But then also is if the United States adopts Bitcoin as a strategic reserve, right? And Wall Street goes bananas and everyone in the US is using Bitcoin, well, most Guatemalans that are sending remittances are in the United States, and so they will quickly catch on. Plus, they know that Bukele is also using Bitcoin, so I'm very bullish on Guatemala being a country that, in general, is primed to adopt Bitcoin. We also have a very conservative banking sector, and so the Guatemalan quetzal, the currency, our currency is called the quetzal. It is a statistical anomaly. In Latin America, there are no currencies that have been stable to the US dollar except Guatemala. So Guatemala is the exception to the rule. Whereas everywhere else in Latin America has had inflation and some cases hyperinflation. Venezuela, Argentina. Guatemala has basically had a stable currency since the early 90s, and basically due to the influence of Austrian economics in our banking system, where the state is not allowed to lend money to itself, but rather is forced to get loans from the private sector or foreigners. And so there is no printing press here. They have found ways around that, basically through the remittance angle, where they are able to get away with printing money, but there's a limit to it. And so there is a very strong influence in certain elite circles in Guatemala to consider sound money. And so, of course, the unfortunate thing is most people like that are saying, oh, bonds, real estate, gold, but they're going to have to catch on very soon. And fortunately, you mentioned Bitcoin Lake. There's been communities here in Guatemala that have been trying to teach as many people as possible. And so I think we have made a significant dent. I think Guatemala is an interesting use case or demonstration that a small group of dedicated individuals can reach enough people where we can kind of push the situation in a different direction.
Get a momentum.
Well, without it being kind of this top-down thing where you got lucky in El Salvador, where Bukele was orange-pilled and he was the ruler of the country with basically complete power. Here, it's much more of a bottom-up thing, where I feel getting closer and closer to a aha moment on a kind of social level, right? But maybe I'm a natural optimist, so maybe I'm just seeing what I like to be seeing, right? Regardless, I'm optimistic.
In your view, is bottom-up adoption sort of the true adoption, and then top-down is more like speeding it up, or
I don't care, man. Anything that gets more people using Bitcoin faster, the better. And so for me, it's you have the contrast with El Salvador, but you have the opportunity to. But if I had a president right now saying, oh, let's adopt Bitcoin as a strategic reserve, let's offer a solution like Chivo where everyone can use it, let's fucking go. Like, there's no reason not to do it. Rather, there's more reason to do it faster. If you have, in a situation like El Salvador, is education of young people is incredibly important, right? The more young people understand that you don't have to rely on Bukele, right? You can just do it yourself. You can learn the tools, study the code, but that, again, in our region, poverty is our enemy, ignorance, malnourishment. Over 50% of our young population is malnourished. Therefore, their brains are not fully developed when they were young kids. And so we have a very significant amount of the population that suffered from child malnourishment. And so in adulthood, they just might simply not be able to grasp the complexities of something as novel and new as Bitcoin. And so that just means that those of us that have that opportunity, I consider it our responsibility to do everything we can to expose people to a new way of doing things, right? And understand that we don't have to always be poor, right? Guatemala doesn't need to be a poor nation for ever, right? We can change.
I heard that Guatemala might be a good country for Bitcoin adoption because the legal tender laws here states that you can use any currency as legal tender, whereas other countries' laws will specify that you need to use the US dollar or the Norwegian kroner. Or do you know a little bit about
of course.
this?
Well, I mentioned there was a lot of Austrian economics influence in Guatemala. A man by the name of Muso Ayau, his nickname was Muso, and so he had a great degree of influence in political and economic leadership of the country. And so basically convinced Guatemala to adopt certain Austrian economics principles. For example, the freedom to negotiate any currency. There's this law called the Law of Libre Negociación de Divisas, the freedom to negotiate currency. So it states that you are free to use basically what Argentina just did, where anyone can negotiate any contract using whatever currency you want. And so, oddly enough, in 2018, the Central Bank of Guatemala came out and said, Bitcoin does not have any regulation. Enter at your own risk. And that is especially so because there is no country that has recognized it as legal tender. Therefore, by the central bank's own definitions in 2018, since El Salvador adopted Bitcoin in 2021, anyone can use Bitcoin in any contract because El Salvador is using it as legal tender. Therefore, anyone in Guatemala can treat it as legal tender or can treat it as collectibles, real estate, whatever you want. You can, all economic actors in Guatemala can treat Bitcoin in whatever is the most logical way for them to treat it. As long as you're consistent, you should be fine. Therefore, it means that Guatemala is one of the best kept secrets in Bitcoin, in that I believe we have the best regulatory environment of anywhere in the world.
There you go.
We are left to our own devices. The state has literally said publicly, we do not regulate it. You can do whatever you want. You just have to do it at your own risk. Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
And hopefully very soon we will be the first country in the world to protect all of our government records with Bitcoin, so that Guatemala will be the first country in the world where history cannot be rewritten by anyone, including the state.
Is there anything you feel like we've left untouched or unturned?
I mean, plenty of things, I'm sure, but come and visit. It's beautiful. Particularly visit between November and February. They are the best months. So you are...
I'm right on.
You either know someone or you are very lucky. Because when it is crap weather in the northern hemisphere, that is when it's the best weather in Guatemala, especially in the highlands. So right now we're in Guatemala City. It's 1,600 meters above sea level. Lago Atitlan is also 1,600 meters above sea level. And so when it's super cold in Norway or anywhere else in the north, it is cool. And you can also go to the beach and it's not super hot. And so definitely come, visit, see it for yourself, spend some sats in Atitlan and elsewhere, and just help us orange pill ourselves into the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Carlos, for
My pleasure.
sharing your insights, and also this very nice rum and cigar.
Salud.
Salud. It's probably going to be obvious for anyone watching me that I don't do this very often.
If you go too hard on it,
Yeah.
it's a little too hard.
Yeah.
But if you just go slow,
Sip it. Yeah.
the tobacco helps.
Yeah.
Central American cigars and Central American rum, I mean, it's good, my friend.
When you smoke a cigar, because you're not inhaling, but the nicotine will still reach you, maybe, but slower, or how
Exactly.
how does
right?
it work?
So it's basically through the saliva, through your tongue, through your stomach, as you're drinking anything, just the saliva in your stomach, and then of course just as you inhale a little bit. So it is a high dose of nicotine.
Yeah, I can feel it.
But
it a bit.
it's not like, I smoked cigarettes for 20 some odd years, and I quit finally. And so
Congrats.
it's, compared to the damage that you do to yourself smoking or vaping, this is even, I don't know the pouches, I don't know, Zin pouches and stuff like that.
Yeah.
For me, this is the old school way. It's like
It's classy.
being a carnivore diet, right? Or
taking
whatever.
it back
It's
to
like,
to the roots.
yep, it's sound money, right? It's cigars, good conversation.
Yeah.
It's hard to beat.
Something you can do once in a while. It's not, you can't like have a cigarette every. You can't have a cigar every 5 minutes.
Exactly, right? It's more of, for me, being a former cigarette smoker, I used to want to smoke one basically all the time. But now it's more of like, all right, it's a special occasion, and I can do it once a week. I can do it once a month. I can do it every day. It's enjoyable.
There's some proof of work in this amount of proof of work put down in this cigar.